In this edition of Locked On Capitals, I am joined by JJ Regan of NBC Sports Washington. As we talk about training camp and what players are going to crack the lineup, we'll talk about the latest on Nick Backstrom and Tom Wilson. And then to end the show, we'll talk about what our predictions are for the Metro Division. We'll talk about all of that and more next on this edition of Locked On Capitals.
Your Locked On Capitals, your daily podcast on the Washington Capitals. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Well, hello and welcome into this edition of Locked On Capitals. I'm so glad you decided to join me today. As always, this podcast is free and available on all the major platforms. And I want to thank you for making this your first listen or view of the day. Yes, this podcast is also available in video form, so head on over to YouTube and check it out. And when you're on YouTube, make sure and hit that subscribe button. And if you like the videos, give it a thumbs up. It really helps grow the channel. My name is Dan Holme. You can find me on Twitter. It's at DanCaps218. You can find the show on Twitter. It's at Locked On Caps. So, like I talked about in this edition, I am joined by JJ Regan of NBC Sports Washington as we talk about the very latest on the Washington Capitals next. All right, in this edition of Locked On Capitals, I am joined by JJ Regan of NBC Sports Washington. JJ, welcome to the show.
Hey, thanks for having me on.
So training camp is starting soon here. It is starting on September 22nd, and it doesn't seem like there's a whole lot of roles open on this team. But what are some of the matchups, or who do you think has a chance of cracking this lineup? Connor McMichael is a guy I'm most looking forward to. Where does he fit into this lineup? I guess that remains to be seen. I've seen some people say he'll fill in on the third line center or perhaps fourth line left wing. What are some of the things that you're looking forward to?
So the biggest question in my mind is Connor McMichael and where he fits into this lineup. This is a team that's always cash strapped. They're up against the cap always. And with Backstrom out and Wilson out, they had a little bit of flexibility, but they took advantage of that by bringing in guys like Connor Brown, by bringing in Dylan Strome. And then you look like a guy like Connor McMichael, clearly NHL talent. Struggled a little bit last year in terms of winning puck battles. I think that was ultimately what led to him not getting as much time as people wanted to see. Had some struggles there, but you know what? At the same time, Lars Eller struggled too last season in his role as third line center. So it looked like, okay, here's a team that needs to clear some cap space. Maybe we see Lars Eller moved in the offseason and Connor McMichael moved into that third line role at center, but that's not what they did. So it'll be interesting for me to see just where Connor McMichael will fit into this initial lineup. Maybe we see it be a fluid situation all year. Maybe he eventually ascends into that third line center role. But for now, it certainly looks like the plan would be coming in for Lars Eller to remain at third line center. And so the question remains, what does that mean for Connor McMichael and where he fits in? In terms of the other young players, I mean, this is still a team that views itself as a contender, and because of that, it makes it hard for those guys to get into the lineup, especially when you go out and when you have openings in your lineup and you go in and you bring in more veterans to fill out that lineup. So it's hard to see where a guy like Axel Jonsson-Fjällby will be able to crack the lineup. Hendrix Lapierre, he will probably benefit from a full year in Hershey before he comes in anyway. But, in terms of roster competition, it looks like they're pretty set with a few question marks towards the bottom of that lineup.
Yeah, because if you look at it, I mean, we can even notice this in the NFL season. Just how you have the season sketched out isn't always how it happens to be. Some teams seem stacked, and then all of a sudden you add a couple injuries, and it kind of changes the complexity of the situation there. So the Capitals, they went out and they addressed the biggest situation. That was the net minding situation. They didn't give it qualifying offers to Vitek Vanacek or Ilya Samsonov, and they picked up the biggest netminder, the free agent out there, in Darcy Kemper, and then they solidified his backup in Charlie Lindgren. So Kemper signed with the Capitals for 5 years at $5.25 million per season. In 57 games in 21-22, Kemper went 37-12-4 with a .921 save percentage and a 2.54. He then posted a 10-4 record and a .902 save percentage en route to the Cup. Just starting with Darcy, how do you feel the Capitals will do this season with Darcy Kemper being their number one netminder?
Well, he certainly makes them better, and he solidifies that position. There's not going to be a back and forth, and let's see if someone can take advantage of this role, because the problem with that philosophy, as we saw last year, is, one of those guys may ascend to that starter role, but what happens if they don't? And that was the problem that we saw. Neither guy could establish himself as a true number one. And so the Capitals were left without one. It's that old saying, if you have two goalies, then you really have none. Well, now they have a goalie. Darcy Kemper is absolutely a starting caliber NHL goalie. I know, yes, he won the Stanley Cup, and I know some people will say, well, look at the team around him. You can't slouch your way to a Stanley Cup. I'm not saying that they won because of him. Obviously, Colorado has a stacked roster. Maybe this year goaltending wasn't as impactful as it has been in recent years for winning a championship. He certainly didn't carry Colorado, but he was good in the playoffs. He was good for them, and he's going to be good for Washington. In terms of what he means for how well the team will play, ultimately, is he a guy who his presence makes them a Stanley Cup contender? No. He makes this team better. He solidifies the position in net, but how far the Capitals will go is going to be determined on the roster around him. And really, if you don't think that roster was good enough, like I do, this roster is good, but I just don't see them as a Stanley Cup contender. And I don't think Darcy Kemper comes in and elevates them to that position. I think they're just a little bit too old to get there at this point. There are a little bit too many holes in this lineup at this point, too many question marks. So he definitely makes them better, but I don't think he's the kind of goalie that comes in and automatically elevates them from playoff team to Cup contender.
Yeah, because when Darcy came to the team, everyone was kind of drinking at the Darcy Kemper Kool-Aid. And I was too. I mean, you went out and signed the biggest name out there. There's nothing to really nitpick at out there. But if I'm going to pick some things that are a bit of concern to me, he has played 50 or more games just twice in his career, 57 last season and 55 in 18-19. And in parts of 10 season has averaged around 30 games played in 28 starts in 10 seasons. So that is a bit of a question mark for me. One of the things that isn't often talked about is he does have kind of a lengthy list on the injury list here. According to NHL Injury Viz, the 31-year-old has missed 83 games through injury since the NHL debut in 12-13 and 50 in the last two seasons alone. How concerned are you about that he hasn't necessarily carried the bulk of the mail for the teams that he's been on? And he does have quite a long list of injuries.
Well, it's something to be aware of. Am I overly concerned of it? Not really, because I think he answered a lot of questions with Colorado. I think his time in a team like Arizona, you think he still played well there, but when you're a goalie, sometimes people will look at it and say, okay, that team is really bad. How much of it is because of the goalie? Because, it's a one individual position. It's not really a team position. It's like the quarterback. It's like a point guard. It's the guy that people look to the most. I think he answered a lot of questions in terms of how good he can be and how far he can take a team last year. So am I overly concerned? No. Am I overly concerned about the injuries? No, because I think they have a lot of faith in Charlie Lindgren. I think he can be good to step in there. It's a concern and something to be aware of. Am I overly concerned about it? Not really. But again, this is coming from me from a perspective of Darcy Kemper makes them better, makes them a deeper playoff team. But will his absence mean that they won't win a cup? Probably not, because I don't really see them as a contender at this point anyway.
Yeah, and that's interesting that you bring that up. There's, all the, NHL insiders and Caps insiders, beat writers, if you will, kind of are having that sentiment about their finishing as well. So you bring up Charlie Lindgren. He is coming off a standout season that saw him go 5-0-0 with a .958 save percentage and a 1.22 goals against with the Blues. And then he had that great run with the Thunderbirds. Charlie Lindgren, a bit of an unproven commodity. But I guess, they went with what they had. Some would question if they had that talent in Hershey in the form of Zach Fucale. So talk to me about Charlie Lindgren a little bit. There is a chance, and I hate to kind of be negative about it, but say, for example, Darcy Kemper does get injured. It's then, in effect, going to be a Lindgren-Fucale tandem. And if you saw one thing last year, you always have to have a really solid number 3 netminder. I don't think that Louis Domingue entering the playoffs was quite in the script there for the Penguins there. So what are your thoughts there on Lindgren and Fucale if called upon?
Well, I'd also like to bring up Clay Stevenson, who was an undrafted free agent who they signed. He was highly sought after. So I don't think he comes in right away and becomes the number 3 just by signing with the team. But I think he's someone to keep an eye on in Hershey to see how he plays, to see if he can elevate himself to that position. A guy like Zach Fucale, he looked great in the few games that he played in. He sort of got lit up in that one. I believe it was against Boston. He didn't get much help around him, so I don't know how much blame you want to put on him for that. But it was one of those guys, it just seemed like he's one of those guys that the coaches see in practice every day. We saw something different in the games, but you have to remember that the coaches see him in practice every day. And he was a guy who never really elevated himself to an NHL level in their mind. He played very well with the opportunities that he was given until that one game against Boston, and it kind of petered out. And, does that mean he won't get another opportunity? We'll see. I think, bringing in a guy like Charlie Lindgren, yeah, he's an unproven commodity. The sample size is pretty small. I think, this is speculation on my part, but I think there may have been a twofold process there. One, he's an NHL backup. It's not a question mark with him like it would be Fucale of how he would play. He's a guy who's been in the NHL the last few years. He can be a backup there. And this makes it and the second point in my mind was this is a clear tandem of a clear number 1 and a clear number 2. A guy like Zach Fucale, who has played a few games last year, the backup goalie suddenly becomes the most popular player in town. I think a lot of fans were charmed by what they saw from him last year with that few games. The inconsistency of Samsonov and Vanacek, and all of a sudden Fucale comes in and he looked great for that handful of games. You don't want Fucale to come in behind Kemper to have a rough first month, and then all of the talk to be, when do we see Fucale? Should we see Fucale? How much more games? We need to see more of Fucale. This makes it very clear. Lindgren, I think it can be very good. I think he's a very good backup, and I think they're in good shape there. But it's also, I think they made a point of making it clear, this is Kemper's net. Lindgren is the clear number 2, and then we'll see what happens below that.
Because I think part of me remembers when Holtby was inserted in there and kind of just came in and like, who the heck is this guy? And I think that a lot of people, myself included, probably think back to that and go, is this the next Holtby? Because, well, it's good to be nostalgic. All right. So after the break here, we're going to continue to talk to JJ Regan of NBC Sports Washington as we talk about Nick Backstrom, Tom Wilson, and our outlook for the Capitals. We'll talk about that next. BetOnline.net is your number 1 source for all your pro and college football betting needs and sports info this season. Find all of the latest football league developments, game matchups, news, and podcasts, including this year's opening week's games. BetOnline is also your continued source for all your sports wagering information, including live betting, esports, and scores. The fastest and easiest way to check in on all your favorite sports and events, including MLB, MMA, boxing, and golf. Head to the website today or use your mobile device to learn more about the trends in action. And guys, if you haven't done this yet, it makes watching the games that much more exciting. Bet online, where the game starts. All right, welcome back into this edition of Locked On Capitals, where it's your team every day. In this edition, I am joined by JJ Regan of NBC Sports Washington. The next thing that we're going to talk about here is Connor Brown in place of Tom Wilson. Connor Brown, top line right wing, is Wilson's replacement, is how they have him penciled in, who has played 7 NHL seasons for the Leafs and Senators, scored 10 goals and 29 assists in 64 games last season, posted a career best 21 goals, which he did in the 2021 season with Ottawa. Connor was traded to the Senators, to the Capitals, for a 2024 second-round pick, 10 goals last season. So just taking a look at him a little bit, $3.6 million cap hit, but not a real apples for apples comparison as far as, you know, body size and the kind of game they bring. Tom Wilson's first season in the league was 13-14. So he's had some more time in the league, and his career best or last season was 24 goals and 28 assists. But this is the interesting thing that I look at. Last season, Tom Wilson, 98 PIM minutes, and Connor Brown, 10. So not necessarily, you know, a tough guy, you know, like Tom Wilson. I don't think that Connor Brown is intrinsically a tough guy per se. Do you think that Connor Brown is the right guy for the job? You know, one of the things that Brian McClellan said is these players, that's where they're penciled in. What it is in actuality, I guess, remains to be seen. I guess you could say Anthony Mantha or someone like that might fight him for that position.
Yeah, I think Connor Brown, as you said, penciled in, and I think that's a good term for it. I think he's the guy who's going to come in and be assumed as the number one. But as we've seen, Peter Laviolette doesn't always do what we expect him to, or what in our minds makes a lot of sense. I wouldn't be surprised to see TJ Oshie get a few games there. He likes the combination of Ovechkin and Kuznetsov with Oshie. Can he still handle a role at that age with all the injuries he came off of last year? Remains to be seen. Connor Brown is insurance for that you don't have to rely on a TJ Oshie, who is now 35, and what happens if he cannot handle that role at this point in his career. If Connor Brown does not work there, then you have a hole in the lineup. I mean, it's pure and simple, because I'm of the opinion that TJ Oshie, a guy like TJ Oshie, played great last year, but was injured all the time. And I know the conventional wisdom can be, well, now that he has an offseason to get healthy, this season should be better. But at 35 years old, you have to wonder, is that just who TJ Oshie is at this point? A guy who's really good when he plays, but is going to be dealing with injuries throughout the rest of his career just because of his age. I'm not calling him old. I'm 35. You know, sometimes you just wake up and you've injured yourself. That's just the way it is at this age. So Connor Brown makes a whole lot of sense. I know Peter Laviolette likes promoting a guy like Connor Sheary too, and putting him in the top 6. Connor Sheary is a guy who will give you, he plays up to the role that you give him. If he plays in the 4th line, he's kind of invisible. If he plays in the top 6, he plays a lot better than you would have anticipated. So I would not be surprised through the first 1 or 2 months until they get Tom Wilson back to see some shuffling until somebody establishes themselves. Hopefully Connor Brown can be that guy. If there's some struggle there, I would not be surprised to see Connor Sheary there. I would not be surprised to see TJ Oshie there. Would not be surprised maybe even to see Garnet Hathaway there, and just see some shuffling to see who can fit in and who can establish themselves in that role.
Yeah, because the Washington Capitals definitely lost quite a bit of their sandpaper, if you will. I know they have Garnet Hathaway in the lineup, who is always up for the challenge to chirp or fight. So they don't really have a lot of tough guys, if you will, in the lineup. I know Alex Ovechkin, if you really press him, will fight, but that's not really the game he plays anymore. There's also a guy like Beck Malenstein, perhaps, down in Hershey that could fill that role. Kind of that bigger frame out there. So kind of an encouraging sign is Wilson is believed to be ahead of schedule in his recovery from ACL reconstruction. So, initial estimates were the end of December around Christmas, and now it's looking like it's going to be a little bit more towards the beginning of the month. So the next player that the Capitals went out to pick up ostensibly to fill Nick Backstrom's position is Dylan Strome, slated to be the second-line center in Backstrom's replacement. The Capitals signed him to a 1-year deal worth $3.5 million, the 3rd overall pick in the 2015 NHL draft. So just taking a look at him, I think that on paper he seems to be a good replacement. I don't really know why the Blackhawks parted with him. It seems like the Blackhawks are a bit of a dumpster fire that's burning out of control right now. So do you think that Dylan Strome will be a good replacement on that second line center?
I do. I like him a lot. I think he's a very good player, and I credit Brian McClellan for being proactive with this and not saying, hey, we got some injuries. We'll see what happens when players come back. And then, I mean, he's going for it. As long as the team, as long as their thought is that we're still contenders. I mean, he's making moves like this to bring in good players here. The thought that I have with this, the problem is that with a guy like Nicholas Backstrom, he's on LTIR. To activate him, you have to make room for his money, his cap hit. So to me, bringing in a guy like Dylan Strome suggests that they don't think Backstrom is going to come back this regular season, which would be conventional wisdom. The surgery he had is very difficult to come back from. Very few players come back and play more than a handful of games if they come back at all. I'm no doctor. I'm just saying that from past of what we've seen, it's very hard to come back from this. And when you load up your cap situation, as the Capitals have, that certainly suggests, I mean, they'd have to clear a lot of cap space to bring Nicholas Backstrom back this season. There would be a lot of shuffling they would have to do in order to do that. So I think this move was made with the thought that Backstrom may not be back this season at all. So to replace, you cannot replace Nick Backstrom and what he means to this team. But Dylan Strome is a good option out there. I like what he brings. I think he can be a very good player. I think he makes that top six still dangerous. And, he's a guy who, when Peter Laviolette decides that this team needs to shuffle, he's a guy who you can put into the top line and see how he plays with Ovechkin. Sometimes you get a second line center who is a middle six center and not a top six center. And so a guy like Lars Eller is a good example. When Lars Eller was in his prime, yeah, you felt good putting him in the second line when you needed to, but he's not someone that you would put in the first line. That's just not his game. That's just not his skill level. A guy like Dylan Strome, he's a top six center. So if you need to put him in the top line for a few games, you can do that. Otherwise, I think he makes that second line dangerous. And it is a good replacement for what is a really tough injury situation for Nicholas Backstrom.
Yeah, and, it's a tough situation with Backstrom. What I've heard is that he is at MedStar Ice Complex, kind of work with the strength and conditioning coach there. And ultimately, I think just to be there for the team photo. But if there's one player, and we'll talk about him a little bit later in the show, but just to kind of tie this in, is Nick Backstrom and the Alex Ovechkin connection. Backstrom has assisted on 274 of Ovechkin's career goals. Ovechkin has assisted on 106 of Backstrom's. Additionally, Backstrom has assisted on 117 of Ovechkin's NHL record 279 career power play goals. And, I know they don't play on the same line together anymore. It's usually Kuznetsov on that top line, but Nick Backstrom and Ovechkin have that long history together. You got to be thinking to a certain extent that Alex Ovechkin is kind of bummed out that his best friend, I guess I got to say, on the team, and one of the guys that's contributed to, really making Alex Ovechkin who he is today, he's got to be a little bit upset that he's not in the lineup.
Oh, I'm sure. And, it really signals, we've been seeing this for a while, but I think it signals the beginning of the end of this era of the Capitals. It's unfortunate to think about. I know they haven't won a playoff series since the incredible 2018 run, but there were circumstances there. Todd Reardon looked overmatched as a head coach when he was in here. They had a lot of injury concerns in Peter Laviolette's first year, and they seemed to run out of gas. Last year, when we started to see a lot of the older players struggled to come back from injuries, just injury after injury after injury, and struggling to come back. And now Nicholas Backstrom out for the foreseeable future. I think it signals that this team really is transitioning, and it's the beginning of the end of this era of the Capitals. And that's sad because, for probably most fans out there, this is the team as they know it. This is guys like Backstrom and Ovechkin brought them into the Capitals. I remember the old days before Ovechkin when the arena was half empty every night, even when this was a playoff team, even when they had a guy like Jaromir Jagr and Peter Bondra and Adam Oates, and it was still a struggle to get the city to embrace this team. So it's not just the end of an era, it's the end of the era that really made it a hockey town. And so that's sad to see.
Yeah, and it's crazy to think about that, the end of the quote unquote rock the red era, if you will, for the Washington Capitals. But we got to proceed. Father Time is coming for us all, and as we talked about, we're all getting older. So are the players on the ice. All right, so after the break here, I'm going to continue to talk to JJ Regan. We're going to talk about Alex Ovechkin and his goal chase. We'll talk about our outlook for the Capitals season next. All right, welcome back into this edition of Locked On Capitals, where it's your team every day. In this edition, I'm joined by JJ Regan of NBC Sports Washington as we talk about the Capitals. And the next one on the list is Alex Ovechkin. Ovechkin went home in the offseason, kind of a risky move, but was able to come back. So I'm glad that was the case. Could you imagine this Capitals team without Ovi in the lineup? So just taking a look at Ovechkin, Ovechkin now has 780 goals. He's 21 away from number 2 Gordie Howe and 114 from number 1 Wayne Gretzky. He could very well pass Howe next season and Gretzky the season after if he keeps up this crazy pace. It won't be easy as he just turned 37. So, JJ, what is your outlook for Alex Ovechkin? We all hope he can, at least beat or, Gretzky at some point here. What is your outlook for Alex Ovechkin?
Yeah, I've given up a long time ago of calling for Ovechkin to decline. People have been calling it for years, and it never seems to happen. So really the number that people should keep in mind this year is 29. I know everyone's looking at Howe, but the number is 29 because if you look at his contract, he has 4 years remaining on his contract. If he averages 29 goals per season, he will beat Wayne Gretzky. And the other thing to keep in mind, it's not just getting to 29. It's that if you beat 29, then it just brings that average down even more. I mean, Alex Ovechkin at some point is going to decline. And so you have to ask yourself, at the age of 40, will he be scoring 29 goals? Last year, when he came into this contract, the average was 33. And with his 50-goal season last year, he was able to bring that average down to 29. Will he be a 29-goal scorer in the NHL when he is 40? I think that's more realistic than 33. And every goal that he gets over 29 makes that even more realistic. I mean, 29 is not unattainable, especially the way he plays. You can just park him on that power play and have him shoot away, and hopefully he'll be able to get to that point. But that's the number that I'm keeping in mind because, as I said, if he surpasses that number, it just brings the average down and makes it more and more realistic. With every goal that he brings that average down, that he will be able to beat Gretzky because at some point he's not going to be a 50-goal scorer in the NHL anymore. If I had to predict, at 37 years old, I'm not going to predict that he's going to score 50 goals again. I have a hard time betting against it, but I can't sit here and say that I'm going to call it. But I also don't think that he's the kind of guy whose production is suddenly going to fall off a cliff unless there's some injury concerns that keep him out of the lineup. I still think he can score between 40 and 45 goals. I still think he's that dangerous. He's going to come in with a top line role. He's still going to be playing with a guy like Evgeny Kuznetsov. He's still going to be getting the power play time. So I think he can still be a plus 40 goal scorer in this league at this point. I know some people, once they pass 30, the production just falls off a cliff. I really do not see that in him. Even if he's not going to score 50 anymore, I still think we could see in the 40 to 45 range.
Yeah, because, you see him getting older and older every year, and that gray hair is creeping in more and more. But, I don't want to make the comparable, but take a look at someone like Tom Brady, for example, who is just totally defying everything out there. So maybe if we could hook Ovechkin up on some of that TB12, we could have him for a longer duration here. So you talked about it a little bit earlier in the program here about thinking that the Capitals aren't, a real playoff contender or a Stanley Cup contender. Some of the favorites so far are the Rangers and the Hurricanes. How do you see the Metro Division shaking out this season?
Well, it's going to be interesting. I think the two clear basement teams are going to be Philadelphia and the Islanders. Philadelphia, I have no idea what they're doing, what their strategy is. Bringing in John Tortorella, I know he has Philadelphia written all over him. But this situation feels a lot more like Vancouver Tortorella than New York and Tampa Bay Tortorella. This just has complete disaster written all over it. The Islanders, overachieved under Trotz. And then the 1 year they underachieved, they got rid of Trotz. And so it's hard to see what the direction is. Plus, they didn't get better in the offseason at all. So I don't know what message you're sending to that team where you're just getting rid of the coach who brought them all this prestige and legitimacy and then didn't help out the team at all in the offseason. So I think they take a step back. Columbus and New Jersey are going to be really interesting. I know Columbus brought in Johnny Gaudreau. The way they were playing last year, it was hard to see where they were going, where they were headed. Don't forget, this is the coach who pulled their goalie with 12 minutes left against the Capitals. So are they in the right hands there? But I think they're going to challenge for a playoff spot. I think New Jersey is a team that every year we look for them to challenge for a playoff spot. I think Carolina and New York are the clear front runners for the division. I like what Carolina is doing. I like the direction New York is going. The real interesting team to me is Pittsburgh because they're the team that has been parallel with the Caps for so long. I don't know why there is always such optimism for Pittsburgh and where they are headed versus the Capitals when neither team has won a playoff series since 2018. Both teams keep getting older. This year, the Capitals got better in the offseason. Pittsburgh really didn't. I think that says a lot about their head coach. I think he's probably the best coach in the NHL. The fact that they think he's still going to be able to keep them as a playoff team. But I see the Capitals. I think they're going to be competing for the third spot in the division, perhaps a wild card spot. I think they are definitely a playoff team. I think Darcy Kemper solidifies them as a playoff team. So I don't see them as the last team in like they were last year. But I don't see them challenging Carolina or New York for the top of the division either.
Yeah, I mean, just kind of taking a look around there, I was surprised that the Islanders didn't really make any moves. I mean, they were linked to Gaudreau and Nazem Kadri, and to cut ties with Barry Trotz just totally boggles my mind. It seems like he gets a cold shoulder wherever he goes. Also, the Washington Capitals, I still cannot totally understand that one. So before I let you go here, JJ Regan, why don't you tell our listeners where we can find your work?
So I'm at NBCSportsWashington.com, and I'm on Twitter at JJReganNBCS. Usually tweet out everything I write. Going to be taking a more editorial role this year than writing, but we, of course, will still be carrying the Capitals as always, and I'm still will be heavily involved with the team and tweeting out and watching every game. So definitely still going to be involved with the Capitals, even if I'm not writing as much as I was in previous years.
All right, that was JJ Regan of NBC Sports Washington. Always fun to have him come on the show and talk a little Caps with him. Thank you for making Locked On Capitals your first listen every day. Now make your second listen Locked On NHL. Locked On Experts give you a daily 30-minute podcast on all NHL things all year long. Stay up to date on everything in the hockey world. Locked On NHL, your daily 30-minute NHL podcast. So, once again, thank you for joining me on this edition of Locked On Capitals. My name is Dan Holme, where it's your team every day. I'll talk to you again next time.